might surprise you to know that witches actually hate Halloween. Witches are generally very quiet, introverted creatures. So the screaming children pounding on our doors and demanding candy, well, that just really isn't our style. The little witch costumes are always kind of cute, though. It's nice to be a role model for just one night. Vampires, on the other hand, love Halloween. Kids aren't usually out after dark, except for on this one night, and so the vampires crawl out of their hovels, or their crummy downtown flats, to ooh and ah over the little children and their costumes. I can tell you're tense already, just thinking about that. Well, don't worry. Our kind have a pact for Halloween. We don't touch children. Because of the nature of some of our population, we can't guarantee that children will always be safe. But on this one night, we make sure the kids can come out and have a good time without fear of losing a limb or worse. We're not the monsters you think we are. Well, not always anyway. So that Halloween night, I found myself sitting in my living room, studying from the anatomy of white magic, drinking some Da Hong Pao black tea, sent to me from my cousin across town. I was finally totally relaxed after what had amounted to a long, hellish week, and was really enjoying myself, when I heard a scraping at the window. I saw a shock of blonde hair outside the glass and had to suppress an eye roll. I absolutely wasn't in the mood to be toyed with that night, but I rose to my feet and stalked over to the window, throwing it open with a dramatic flick of my wrist. The creature outside my window clapped as though the very sight of me inspired awe. "Hey, sweetheart, invite me in," he purred, his voice deep and smooth and hypnotic. "Don't call me sweetheart," I deadpanned, crossing my arms over my chest. "Geez, fine. You can be such a hard ass," he said, irritation showing in his voice. I could tell it rankled him that his seductive powers had no effect on me. "Come on, just let me in. I really need to talk to you." "Is it about Halloween?" I asked. "It's about Halloween, and it's very important." I stared at him with pursed lips for a second. When people think of vampires, they generally think of tall, pale, dark hair, brooding, that kind of thing. Honestly, I blame Dracula. Bram Stoker was such a drama queen. The man before me was none of those things. He had sandy blonde hair and a deep tan, flashing blue eyes and blindingly white teeth. He had a real Beach Boy aesthetic. "And they call this guy a creature of the night," I scoffed. "Vampires get all the good literature." I uncrossed my arms and said, "Fine. Come in, Gale." He climbed in through the window and landed lightly on his feet, smiling at me. Smirking, more like it. "I always knew I'd get inside your house one day." "Seriously, what do you want? I'm having a perfectly lovely night in, and I don't need you here to ruin it." "Ooh, you wound me." He clutched his heart and threw his other hand over his eyes, as though about to faint. My lips twitched, but I forced back a smile. "Come on, just spill it. You said it was important." He sighed. "You're no fun, you know." Then he became serious. "We have a problem down on the east side of the city." "What do you mean?" "At least 4 kids have gone missing. They were trick-or-treating together. I ran into their parents, who are pretty frantic with worry. It could be nothing, but I have a feeling that somebody has taken them." "Do you have anything to base this feeling on?" I asked. He shrugged. "Number. But it's a pretty bad feeling. I'm going to go look for them. I'd appreciate if you'd help me out." I gazed longingly at my tea and book. I'd really much rather have stayed inside, but Gale was only 200 years old. He was still finding his feet as a vampire, and it would be just like him to run off and do something stupid and get in totally over his head. And then I'd have to deal with the fallout. At least that's what I told myself. So I'd have an excuse to say yes. I heaved a put-upon sigh. Fine. Let me get my coat. And shut the window. We're going out through the door, like civilized people." I turned to grab my coat, then thought better of it. I ran to the closet near the foyer and pulled out a black cloak, a bag, a pointed black hat, and a broom. I heard Gale muffling laughter behind his hand. Wow, are you for real right now? It's Halloween, I shrugged. I might as well look the part. I didn't wait to hear any of his other comments before stalking out the door in search of whoever was ruining my night. It only took me a moment to get us to the other side of town. Witches have a lot of ways of getting around. My favorite method is to manipulate reality, melt the reality we exist in, and transfer to a reality where I'm at my target destination, then merge the two reality strands. Sci-fi fans would like you to believe that this is dangerous, but their fears are vastly overstated. There is nothing so mundane and easy to manipulate as time. Gale, however, was not nearly so used to this sort of magic. He crouched down with his hands clutching his head when we stopped. "What's wrong? Feeling a bit queasy, are we?" I asked. I was glad I had chosen a secluded area as my destination. That way nobody would bother us to ask if he was okay. "How do you do that and not vomit every time? Seriously?" He looked pale as he focused on taking deep breaths. I waited patiently as he calmed himself down. We were back on the move 5 minutes later, watching all the children running around, giggling, screaming. "Look, Mom, it's a witch, a real witch," shrieked a little girl. She had a sparkly purple tutu, a pointed hat, and a very ornate wand that I surmised she had painted herself. "I see that, sweetie," said her mother. She winked at me and I laughed. "Hey, you're good with kids," said Gale as we turned down a side street. There were fewer kids the further we moved, even though this part of town was pretty densely populated. "You sound surprised." My voice was dry, and I was shocked to find myself a little offended. "I just never knew you liked them, is all. I could get you one if you want." He waggled his eyebrows at me, and I gave him a look of total disgust. "Not like that. I just swipe one." "You're just making it worse," I mumbled, pointedly ignoring him. He grabbed my arm and pointed at the end of the street. There was a group of parents speaking to some police officers. That must be why the trick-or-treaters are staying away from here, I thought. "Let me get a little closer. I'll see if I can hear what they're saying," said Gale, slinking off down the street, hiding in the shadows of the buildings. "Don't get caught," I hissed. I stood there awkwardly in the dark, wondering if I should have followed him. I was beginning to feel nervous for absolutely no reason at all. I wondered if it was a premonition. No, that can't be it, I thought. Gale just got his panties in a bunch over nothing. Hell, the cops will probably find the kids before we do. Maybe they just snuck off to the woods or something. Gale reappeared next to me while I was lost in thought, and I just about shrieked. "Don't do that," I said. He grinned at me. "I knew I could get you. I heard the parents say the kids disappeared while they were on J Street. The parents took their eyes off of them, and when they turned around, the kids were gone." "Jeez, how can they just let kids out of their sights on Halloween?" I mumbled in irritation. "It's like they want them to get killed. Well, we might as well head down to J Street. Keep an eye out for anything suspicious." "Don't worry, I'll sniff them out," Gale replied. I shuddered a little at that. It's true, vampires have very keen senses, and his super hearing or super smelling might turn out to be useful in just such a situation. But it still weirdly grossed me out. Unnatural, that's what it is. Yeah, I know. I'm one to talk." As we headed towards J Street, Gale asked, "What will the association do if it's one of us?" The association is hard to explain. It's sort of like our version of government. It's a bit less restrictive, I guess. They don't have many rules. It's just that the rules they do have are very, very important. You really don't want to break them, trust me. Well, there will be an investigation, I'm sure. And once the association makes a decision, I'd guess it would be death. Gale paled. "You mean like permanent death?" "Yup." I was sort of enjoying watching him squirm. "So you better watch yourself. One misstep, and you could have a blessed wooden stake right through your heart. He glared at me. That is not funny. He stopped short just as we stepped onto J Street. He lifted his head and took a long sniff, like some kind of hunting dog. I could just picture him with ears and a tail. It was actually a cute thought. Oh no. Oh no. I shook my head to clear it of that horrifying vision just as he looked at me with excitement. I can smell it. They're here. I know it's them. What do you smell? Blood. Shit. Is it a lot of blood? I mean, the smell is pretty strong, so there must be a significant... Oh. His grin faded as he realized the implications of what he was saying. Well, maybe it isn't them after all. Can you take me to the source? He nodded and started down the street with renewed vigor. So, are you going to tell me your real name? Gale asked. Nope. Gale frowned at me. Come on, we're friends. Nothing doing. Surely you don't want me to call you Ambrosia forever? I grimaced. Ambrosia is the name given to me by the Council of Witchcraft. It's symbolic, but also practical. It binds me to the other witches in our community, and if I were to ever break our code, they could use it to subdue and restrain me. Plus, no witch gives out her real name. Our real names hold unbridled power over us, and to do so could very well mean suicide. But still, Ambrosia. That's got to be the worst name in the history of names. Seriously. I'll think about it, I answered. Hey, if you don't want to use that name, why don't you just join a coven instead? No. My voice came out much louder than it needed to be, but seriously, I would never dream of disgracing myself by joining a coven. Covens are for witches who are rejected from the council and who are stuck in the Middle Ages. You know those pictures of witches you see, where they're a bunch of old, haggard women covered in boils and eating children? Yeah, those are the kind of crazies you get when you start a coven. Hard pass. Hold on, said Gale, holding up his hand. His head tilted to the left, and he sniffed the air again. It's there. He pointed to a rather large house with the lights off. It didn't look like a super welcoming place. No Halloween decorations, no sign of any life. I wondered why the kids walked up to it. Other than the fact that, kids are dumb and tend to do dumb things. All right, let's go in. We made our way up the pathway, and I stooped down in front of the door. After discovering the door was locked, I slipped a bobby pin from my hair and started to jiggle it around the lock. Come on, don't you have some kind of, door unlocking spell? Asked Gale. He was bouncing on his feet, eager to find the source of all the blood. Yeah, I don't use magic on something that stupid. Picking a lock is easier and, honestly, faster. I heard a click and tried the handle again. This time it turned. Okay, let's go. We entered the house prepared to search it from bottom to top in order to find the source of the blood, but it turns out we didn't have to. We found a body slumped against the wall in the foyer, blood smeared on the walls and pooled on the floor. Gale swore as I knelt down by the child and put my finger to his throat. He was definitely dead, as if the sheer amount of blood loss hadn't already given me my answer. The child couldn't have been more than 8. He'd been wearing a Superman costume that was now torn in the chest. He had multiple stab wounds in his chest cavity and a few in his legs and arms. His eyes were blue and glassy. What do we do? Asked Gale, all traces of his earlier humor gone. First, let's find the others, I said. I stood up and gave the dead kid a pat on the head, as though it would comfort him. Not that he really needed it anymore. A few blood drops led us further into the house, past the dining room and into the kitchen, where we found what appeared to be the basement door ajar. As we approached the door, we could see a light and hear the faint sound of somebody crying. That must be it, I said. I turned to Gale. When we go down there, Our primary goal is to get the kids out. Whatever has them, you hold it off while I grab the kids, okay? What do you think it is? He asked. He was trying not to sound worried. Well, it used a knife, so I would guess it's a rogue witch or wizard, performing a dark magic ritual. You'll need to be careful, but we have an advantage. They aren't expecting a vampire. He nodded, and I took that as permission to begin my descent. We crept down the stairs as quickly and quietly as we could. The basement slowly came into my field of vision. There were 2 children tied and gagged in the far corner of the basement, a spaceman and a pirate. At the other end of the room, there stood a man with his back to us. He was holding a young girl against the wall by her left hand. She too was gagged, and she was dressed like a witch. I saw the man had a knife in his hand, and I realized what was happening the same second that Gale did. Holy shit, he's human, isn't he? Gale didn't bother whispering or concealing his voice. Everyone in the room turned to look at him, me included, and I glared. What? He shrugged. This'll be a piece of cake, honestly. I looked back at the man and the girl and saw that she was missing a finger on her hand, the man having sliced it off with his knife. My eyes went dark and I saw red. All right, Gale, kill him. Gale's face went slack and his fangs peeked out from under his lips. He rocked back on his heels and then lunged towards the man. You'll notice that I haven't actually told you what the man looked like. The murderer. And there's a good reason for that. See, he was just so ordinary. When I first laid eyes on him, the scene seemed so absurd to me. He looked like a regular, middle-aged, balding salaryman. There was nothing sinister about him, nothing that would indicate that he was fucked up, that he liked murdering children. And somehow, that scared me more than anything I've ever encountered in our world. And it's something I don't like to think about. So I watched Gale lunge at the man with something akin to relief. As Gale slammed the man into the wall, he dropped the child, and she sat on the ground, sobbing behind her gag. I ran to her and grabbed her, dragging her back to the corner with her friends. I sat her down by her friends and started searching the floor frantically. I spotted her finger on the ground and grasped it, bringing it towards her. She was pale and hyperventilating, about to enter into shock. I placed her finger back in its rightful place and reached into my bag, grabbing out a handkerchief and a small blue vial. I wrapped the handkerchief around the hand and finger and breathed over it, mumbling a spell to myself as I did. I poured the blue solution onto her hand and let it soak into the cloth. I waited for a beat or two before removing it. Her finger was reattached and good as new, with nothing but a small white scar to show that it had ever been injured. She stared at it in wonder, her breathing evening out. I reached up and pulled her gag off. "Hi there, my name is Ambrosia. What's your name?" I asked her. She stared at me uncertainly for a moment. Her eyes shifted behind me, and I could hear the slurping, sucking sounds Gale was making. No, don't look there. Look at me." Her eyes shifted back, and she took a deep breath. Samantha," she said. I smiled at her. "That's a beautiful name. Are you a witch, Samantha?" She nodded, then shook her head. "Well, I'm not a real witch. I'm just pretending." "I see. You could have fooled me. You look just like a real witch." "Samantha, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to face the wall and not turn around. I'm going to untie your friends, and then we're going to go find your parents. How does that sound?" She nodded and turned towards the wall. I slipped a switchblade out of my pocket and cut the ropes off the other children. "All right, guys, let's get out of here, shall we?" "What is he doing to that man?" asked the pirate. I had a very good idea of what Gale was doing, but I decided to avoid that particular topic. "You guys don't have to worry about that. That man isn't going to hurt you anymore, and my friend wouldn't dream of hurting you. We want to help you. That means you have to come upstairs with me, all right?" The kids nodded, a little hesitant, but still trusting. I couldn't imagine still trusting someone after what they'd seen, but that's what's magical about kids. I led them upstairs. I kept them distracted while we walked by the body of their friend. As we reached the door, I turned around and knelt down. I whispered a few words in each of their ears and watched as their eyes went blank. I ushered them out the door. "Your parents are down the street, waiting for you. Go on now." They walked away in something of a daze. A quick memory wipe will do that to a person. I turned back and looked at the dead child in the foyer. "Now what do I do with you?" I murmured. I stared for a moment, then walked back down to the basement. Gale was kneeling over the body of the murderer, covered in his gore and blood. The man had been eviscerated, his entrails pulled out and spread around the room in disarray. His fingernails had been pulled out and shoved into his eyes. His teeth were scattered all over the floor. Dude never had his wisdom teeth taken out, I guess. He was still gurgling and choking on his own blood as I walked over. I could see that Gale had left him alive, at least for the time being. "Geez, could you take any longer?" I asked. The man's head jerked towards me, terror written in the lines of his face. I looked away and focused on Gale. Well, after what he did to the other kid, I wasn't going to give him a quick death. Blood dripped from Gale's lips and covered his front. His pupils were so large, they overtook the color of his eyes. That happens when they feed. I'm not sure why, but I've always found it enormously attractive. But I found it even more attractive that he was showing enough self-control to make this son of a bitch suffer. Well, we need to pick up the other kid's body and get out of here, so if you could finish up. He nodded and grasped the man's face in both his hands. Straddling the body, he yanked hard and fast. The sound of his flesh distending and snapping was sickening. His body flailed a moment after the decapitation, but it didn't last very long. It was a relief when he stopped moving. I didn't want to think about the world housing that kind of human. "Help me grab the kid, will you?" We went upstairs and Gale lifted the child into his arms. He looked at me in confusion. "What do you want him for? Don't you think maybe we should just leave him here for the police to find?" I shook my head. "I can do you one better." I grabbed onto Gale and transported us back to my house, my plan already in place. "Remind me why we're doing this again?" Gale was sitting on my back porch as I placed the child in the coffin. It's a beautiful coffin. It's made of oak and has intricate carvings all over it. More importantly, it is etched with runes, thousands of them. I shut the lid and caressed it, reading through some of the runes. I smirked a little at Gale's confusion. He was about to get a first-class show, that's for sure. "Are you gonna, I don't know, bury him or something?" I just laughed and shook my head. "Have you ever heard of necromancy?" He recoiled a little. "I thought you were a white magic witch, not a, Geez, necromancy isn't all about black magic. I mean, sure, you could do it that way, but it's a lot harder and it's pretty disgusting. You have to cook and eat a dog and abstain from the sight of women. It's a pain, and the end result is distorted. But if you do it using white magic, well, if you're lucky, it just might work. The results aren't guaranteed, but hey, it's better than nothing." As I spoke, I took off my jacket and rolled up my sleeves. I flexed and stretched my fingers. I didn't want to pull a muscle in my hand with what I was about to do. He looked at me like I was insane. "How come I've never heard of this?" I shrugged. "You're young. There's lots of things you don't know. Like your phone number." He flashed a smile at me, and I shook my head in despair. "There's no hope for you, seriously." With that, I stretched my hands over the coffin. I began to mutter to myself, reciting the runes that graced the lid. My voice fell into an even cadence as I grew louder, the world fading around me in my concentration. On the 5th line, I brought my right hand to my left wrist, feeling for the pulse that beat just below my skin. On the 10th line, I plunged my fingernail through my skin and into my artery, letting my blood drench the lid of the coffin. It seeped into the rune carvings and disappeared while my chanting continued. I could hear other voices joining me now, voices from different times and spaces and existences. I finally recited the final and 20th line, my strength failing me. I let myself fall forward on the lid of the coffin, my blood still flowing freely from my wrist as I struggled to breathe. I was losing a lot of blood very quickly. If the ritual was going to work, it had to work now. I very vaguely became aware of being lifted off the coffin lid. I realized after a moment that Gale was cradling me, my wrist lifted to his mouth. He was licking my wound, which, I realized, had closed when it came in contact with his saliva. Vampire saliva has many healing properties. Not that I appreciated it at that exact moment. Don't interfere, Gale. It was hard getting enough breath to speak. I had lost a dangerous amount of blood. You're a goddamn idiot, Ambrosia. Are you trying to kill yourself? You know, you could pick better ways to do it than to bleed out in front of a vampire. I have to. The ritual. No ritual is so important that you endanger yourself like that. What the hell were you thinking? A bit of clarity was coming back into my head. I opened my mouth to retort when he and I both heard it. A tentative knock was coming from inside the coffin. Hello? Is anybody there? Gale's jaw dropped, and I struggled out of his arms, wrenching the coffin lid open. The little boy looked at me in terror. His wounds, however, were gone, and the blood had vanished from his costume. I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. It was a victory I never expected. I struggled to help him out of the coffin until Gale took over. I didn't even mind, I was so elated. It worked. I couldn't believe it worked. The coffin was a family heirloom, and while I knew of its powers, I'd never tried to access them before. It takes a perfect specimen. The boy was freshly dead and had a pure, innocent soul. With anyone else, who knows if it might have worked. Furthermore, the ritual is incredibly dangerous, and many witches have died trying to complete it. That night, I easily could have been one of them. We sat the kid down and learned his name, his address. He was confused and didn't remember anything, except for being out and about with his friends. He had no memories of his murder, which was good. We didn't have to wipe his memory at all. We told him he hit his head, that we'd found him on the sidewalk and brought him to my place to see if he was okay. Gale offered to walk him home. It was getting late now, and surely his parents were worried. And so, Gale helped me into the house and sat me down on my chair, back with my book and tea. Then he took the boy by his hand, and they walked towards the front door. I noticed that Gale had already charmed Charlie, and the two were getting along splendidly. Gale was good with kids, too. I noted that and filed it away, for future reference. Hey, Ambrosia, you busy next Wednesday? He asked me before opening the door and disappearing into the night. I might be, I might not. Why do you ask? You, me, dinner, 8 o'clock. I'll pick you up at 7:30. I thought about it, then gave him a laugh. We'll see, but no promises. He grinned and gave me a little wave as he ushered Charlie out into the darkness. I watched them go, content in the knowledge that Gale would get him safely where he needed to go. And despite my indifferent response, I was definitely going to dinner with Gale. I groaned a little and put my face in my hand, trying to fight a smile and a blush. Whoever thought that a vampire would be my type? I think a lot about that saying a lot around this time of year. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. Scary stories, orange and yellow leaves, purple lights, and hot apple cider. Candy and chilling winds, jack-o'-lanterns and pumpkin spice everything. It's the one time of year you can dress up and hide who you are underneath masks and makeup. Be whatever you want, and no one knows who you are. I've loved Halloween since I was a kid. As far back as I can remember, my dad always made such a big deal about the holiday. My mother, not so much. They divorced when I was young, and I've always lived between two households. Typically, I'd be at my dad's during the weekends, and my mom's on the weekdays. I'd always pray that Halloween would fall on a weekend so I could be at my dad's house when it happened. He'd always invite my friends over for a big Halloween party. He'd dress up in a scary costume, hand out fun treats, and take me trick-or-treating. My mom, on the other hand, well, she despises the holiday. She's very religious. She's always reading the Bible, lecturing me about this and that. She's got it in her head that Halloween is an evil holiday. She won't have anything to do with it. Not even so much as a harvest festival alternative that some of the local churches around us hold. In fact, she doesn't even go to the churches in our town, and we have a ton of them. She never put up jack-o'-lanterns, and not even a hint of fall decor. Not even a be thankful sign for the autumn season or Thanksgiving. My mom is nice enough. She's never been too pushy about her beliefs on me. In fact, she celebrates every other holiday just fine. Christmas, Thanksgiving. She'll even have a beer or two on St. Patrick's Day. But she absolutely has never budged when it comes to Halloween. In fact, she'd make me go to bed really early on Halloween every time I happened to be with her. We've gotten into some very nasty fights over it. I'd be crying and begging her to let me stay up and go trick-or-treating. But she'd always respond that Halloween was evil, and that in her house she'd respect the Lord. Then she'd tell me I would just have to get used to it. I once told her I hated her because of it, and stormed off to my room, slamming the door. I regret doing that now. I now know she was only trying to protect me. My mom lives several miles away from my dad in a small rural town with about 3,000 people living there. My dad lives in the city, so when I had Halloween at his place, I'd bring back a huge haul of candy because we had so many neighbors. Everyone got into the holiday spirit on my dad's street. In my mom's neighborhood, everyone there did too. So the stark difference between my mom and the town, and mom and my dad has always been really apparent to me. And up until last year, I just had never understood why my mom was such a prude. When I mentioned it to my dad and asked him to make my mom relent, he'd always say, "Your mom has to do things her way, and I'll do things my way. You just have to respect her wishes, buddy." If you look at the calendar, you'll notice Halloween falls on weekdays way more than it falls on weekends. So sadly, I haven't had the experience of being with my dad on Halloween as much as I'd like. I always noticed how much my mom seemed to dread the holiday. She'd be extra into her Bible, praying. Sometimes she'd come up to me and put her hand on me, closing her eyes in prayer, begging God to protect me. Halloween has always been the same at her house. We'd eat dinner around 4 p.m., then she'd usher me off to bed. She wouldn't tolerate me stepping out of my room, and she'd yell at me to sleep if she heard me staying up. I'd always lay in bed, unhappy and frustrated. I'd hear just outside my door, saying the same prayers over and over again. You might be asking why I didn't just sneak out. Well, I would have, except my mom always had the odd habit of boarding up all of our windows, and even our front and back doors. She'd put up a big sign on the front door that said, "Trick-or-treaters not welcome. At this house we serve Jesus." She'd hang up crosses and sprinkle the whole house with holy water. Even line the front entrance with salt. I always figured my mom was just extra paranoid about things, or had gotten it into her head from some televangelist that she needed to be extra scared of spirits and whatnot on Halloween. I've never stayed up very late on Halloween night at my mom's house. With nothing to do but lay in bed, as she usually took all of my toys or devices away, I'd usually fall asleep surprisingly easily. I'd dream about what Halloween could have been, and try to get over it the next morning on November 1st. It wasn't until last year I finally found out why my mom is so scared of Halloween. Last year, Halloween fell on a Monday. That year was especially hard for me to accept that I'd be spending yet another fun Halloween night sleeping in early, especially since the year before Halloween had fallen on a Sunday and my dad had pulled out all the stops. I dreaded having to spend another year in bed early when for the last 2 years I had been spoiled with Halloween fun. This year was a bit different. I was 17 now, and I felt I could get away with staying up a bit longer, and at the very least being allowed to watch a scary movie. I got to my mom's house earlier that day, as my dad had gotten me out of high school early. When I arrived, the house was drab and normal, no decor, nothing except for wood beams in piles ready to be nailed up. I hugged my dad goodbye, and he told me to behave myself and just do as my mom said, however upset or unhappy it might make me. Great. Another Halloween puritanically wasted. I went up the steps to our house, said hi to my mom, and hugged her. I asked my mom if this year could be different, if maybe I could stay up and watch scary movies, maybe have some candy. She flat out refused. Absolutely not. Halloween is an evil holiday. You will not have anything to do with it at my house. God help me. I roared with irritation. So unfair. I stomped inside. You're so fucking ridiculous, Mom, I shouted out. I heard her yell about taking the Lord's name in vain. I didn't care. I was so sick of her religious strictness. I needed to get out of the house for a bit. I walked up to the porch where she was standing, apologized for cussing, and asked if I could head down to the store in town for some snacks before we had our early dinner and early bedtime. She sighed. Son, I know you don't understand why I do these things. I know Halloween means so much to you. But it's evil, son. The devil hides in the fun things. Halloween is evil. I wish I could get you to understand. She said it would be okay, but to be home no later than 3 p.m. She was dead serious. I didn't want to find out the fit my mom would have if I didn't stick to her curfew. I walked off towards the main area of town with all the small businesses. My mom luckily didn't live too far from the general store, only 4 or 5 blocks away. I got to the store and was looking at some of the hot Cheetos when a priest came up to me. I glanced over and he said hello. Hi there. Need anything? I asked. I'm sorry to bother you, but I noticed you weren't dressed up, the priest said, his hands clasped in a pious manner. I was supposing perhaps you weren't participating in any of the festivities this evening. I was wondering if perhaps you would like to attend my church's Harvest Festival party. There'll be candy and even a costume party. I already knew what my mom would say if I asked, so I gently sighed and responded, That's really nice of you, but I actually have other plans tonight, sadly. I'm sorry. The priest smiled and said that was quite all right. He bid me goodbye and told me he wished the Lord would bless me. He walked off and I took my chips to the register. I walked back home and sulked. My mom wouldn't have ever allowed it, even if it was at a church. She'd say that it was just another form of Halloween and that it was evil and that it was out of the question. I couldn't wait to turn 18 and be out on my own, make my own plans, celebrate Halloween the way I wanted to. I just didn't understand. To me, Halloween wasn't evil, or even unchristian for that matter. Sure, it dealt with death and ghosts and ghouls, but it was mostly about fun for me. Costumes, candy, maybe even some sexy times or partying. It wasn't about anything bad. In some ways, Halloween helped us laugh at death. It was the one time of year death wasn't so scary, so horrible. Wasn't there a saying my mom once told me? Something like, "Oh death, where is your victory? Oh death, where is your sting?" If anything, Halloween perhaps could help Christians live out that reality. But my mom would never understand that. I went up to the house, trudged in, and ate my snacks while watching my mom start to nail the doors and windows shut. There was no more going out tonight. She was soon done, and the doors and windows were locked. Her sign fluttering on the door, making knocking sounds every time the wind came and hit the wood. Then she made a quick pasta dinner. I ate it in silence, making it known my displeasure. My mother ate in silence as well, looking at the boarded windows nervously. Then she checked her watch. "It's 4 p.m., son. Finish up and get to bed." I sighed. I ate as slowly as I could. Every passing moment, my mother seemed to get more and more nervous. I had a few bites left of my meal, but my mom suddenly shot up and shooed me away from the table. "That's enough for now. You need to get to your room. Go." I rolled my eyes and walked to my room. My mom closed the door behind me. I looked around my room. I looked at my bedroom window, boarded up with wood. I could see between the slits in the wood. I could see the neighbor's house and the orange and red trees. The sun was still up. I sighed yet again, filled with annoyance. I plopped down on my bed. My mom had taken my phone. There was no TV, no books, nothing to do but try to get to sleep. I stared up at the ceiling in my room. I heard my mother walk up outside my bedroom door, starting to pray. "The blood of Jesus protect us tonight. Father God, protect us tonight. Amen." I just couldn't stand it anymore. I furrowed my brow in anger. I was 17, damn it. I wasn't following my mom's lame rules anymore. I made up my mind. Tonight, whether she liked it or not, I was getting up out of my room and doing something Halloween-related. I was gonna watch Child's Play. Or Scream. If I couldn't leave the house, I could at least watch the kids trick or treating nearby. I decided I'd wait until after my mom was done praying and had gone to bed herself to sneak out of my room. I listened to her praying. "Jesus, have mercy. Lord, protect us from evil. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us." I lay there listening to her pray for about an hour. I glanced over at my alarm clock. It was about 6 p.m. by the time she finally finished. I heard her walk off and gently close her bedroom door. I couldn't get out of bed just yet. I needed to wait until I was sure she was asleep. I sat up in bed and looked out of the cracks in between the boards. The sun was rapidly going down. Yet oddly, there weren't any trick-or-treaters out quite yet. I waited, watching the sky grow ever darker until I was sure my mom was asleep. It was about 7:45 p.m. The sun was mostly down at this point. Only a slight yellowish glow remained on the horizon. I went up to my bedroom door. I slowly, ever so slowly, turned the knob. I managed to turn it without so much as a sound, and then I gently pulled the door open. It made a slight squeak, and I winced as it did so. Nothing. My mom hadn't heard. Thank God. I pulled open even more, just enough so I could squeeze my body through and I could get out into the hallway. I did so, and I glanced down the hall at my mom's room. I could hear her gently snoring. I tiptoed to the living room. I went to the couch and sat down, picking up the remote. I turned on the lamp on the side table near me and selected a streaming service on the TV. Scream, here I come. I turned the volume down as low as I could. I looked up at the clock on the side of the living room wall. It had just turned 8 o'clock. Some preview for a show I didn't care about was playing when suddenly the power went out. I sat up, confused. The lamp was out. I tried to turn it on again, but nothing. I glanced outside between the gaps in the boards on the window. The streetlights were out. Even the lights from the Halloween decor of our neighbors was dark. I watched as the sky grew darker and darker. Perhaps there had been a power surge. But the weather wasn't bad. It had been a perfect, cloudless day. I sat there, perplexed. Then I finally saw something. It was a gentle orange glow. At first, I didn't see what it was. But as I kept looking, I eventually saw a small group of children dressed in Halloween costumes. They held torches in their hands. They had potato sacks to collect candy clutched at their sides. They walked up the street, slowly like zombies. Then another group came. Each of the kids had a mask on. Some were clowns, some were animals, some were skulls or demon faces. But not a single child had their face exposed. Group after group came down the street, silent as the grave. Then I saw more groups. This time, they were made up of what I could only assume were adults. They were far taller and fatter in many cases. Some were holding the hands of little ones. They had masks on too. On had a cartoon cat's mask on. Another had a Guy Fawkes mask. Yet another had what I could only describe as a voodoo mask. They all held torches, lighting their way as the sky finally became devoid of sunlight and pitch black. The torches cast shadows on the neighborhood and the houses, the haunting orange glow reflecting and amplified by the orange of the leaves on the trees and ground. Many people clearly were traveling as families. I saw groups of 5, sometimes 10. Silently, they went up the street. Then I saw one man sum up. He had a special mask on. It was a large black mask with 3 skulls, presumably human, in a triangle formation on the black background, 2 on the bottom, 1 skull on top. He held a torch and an enormous knife with a red hilt. He stopped in the middle of the street and shouted something. Whatever he said, it made the groups of people stop and turn around to face him. He used the hand that had the knife and yelled something, pointing it towards the houses around him. Then he walked on. He was out of sight, and I wanted a better look at what was going on. I crawled up to the window and pressed my eye against the glass, looking through the gaps in the boards. I could see much more now. The little children had circled back around. They went up to the houses nearby and knocked on the doors. They then stood there waiting for someone to answer. I watched as one of my neighbors, a sweet blonde-haired lady, opened the door with a smile, holding an orange bowl of Snickers. She was about to say something and comment on the kids' costumes, but looked at the kids in wonder. They held their torches and stood there, not even saying the customary trick or treat. The lady laughed nervously and asked if they wanted some candy. "Boy, you guys are really scary. You definitely win that award," she commented, trying to hand one of the kids with the green witch's mask a candy bar. The kid didn't accept it, but instead pointed at her. One of the adults came up to the porch, briskly walking over. The woman's eyes widened, and she screamed as the adult roughly took her by arms and dragged her to the street. Her husband came out yelling at the adult to let her go, but 3 other masked adults came out and wrestled him to the ground. They then tied up both people, kicking and screaming. I couldn't believe my eyes. Some of my neighbors looked outside of their doors to see what was happening, only for them to be snatched up next. The children led the way as the adults brought crying and screaming people down the street. I watched on of my neighbors' houses open up, only for a few people I presumed were my neighbors to walk out with masks on, holding their kids' hands behind them, also in masks, to join in the activity. The same thing happened over and over again. The kids would go up to a door, they'd knock, and someone would answer. Then they'd be attacked, tied up, and dragged away to join others. I watched as they headed towards the direction of the main area of town, where all the shops and businesses were at. I listened as people begged to be let go, men cursing and demanding the reason for all of this. A woman screamed as a masked man got up close to her, grabbed her by the hair, and stroked her face with a gloved hand. I watched as more groups of masked people came, dragging teenagers and children with them, on a cart. They were all crammed into a cage, some crying, others yelling similar things to the adults. I looked at their wrists and saw they had orange bands. I couldn't read what was on them, but the same symbol as the one found outside on the local Catholic church was on them. More teenagers came, literally by the cartful, crammed into tiny cages with at least a dozen others. I heard wailing and screaming. I watched as they all headed to the main part of town. Then I watched as the children went out into the woods with their parents, leaving the masses of people about 200 of them, sitting in the street, to be watched by the skull man with the knife and a few other large masked men with other weapons and torches. They struggled against their ties, and the caged youth tried futilely to move. I shuddered as I watched orange lights dive in and out of the trees. The flames on their torches dimmed and flickered in the slight wind outside, making their disappearing sparks look like flashing Halloween lights and will-o'-the-wisps. It was pitch black outside except for the flames. The power was still not back on. As much as I wanted to crawl back into bed, I couldn't tear myself away from the strange events happening outside. I had to keep watching. The children came out of the woods, dragging large branches of wood behind them. They began to pile them up in the center of town until they had built a huge pile of them. A mountain of wood was formed, and then all of the masked people got into a large group in front of the skull man with the knife. The man held his hand up with the knife and handed his torch to a man with a goat mask on. There were so many of them. The skull man spoke. "People, it is that time of year again. All Hallows' Eve is upon us once more. Let us remember our commitments. Our Father awaits us. They await us. Let us celebrate." My eyes widened, and my heart jumped into my throat upon hearing his voice. His voice was the same as the priest's I had spoken to earlier that day at the grocery store. A cheer rang out from the masked crowd, who clapped their hands. The priest in the skull mask held out his hand, and a man in a gorilla mask brought the blonde neighbor of mine up in front of him. Her face was stained with mascara as she cried, begging, asking what was happening and why they were doing this. The skull-masked man held her by her hair and brought her throat up to his knife. The children in mask went to the front of the crowd and waited expectantly. The priest made a shout and slit the blonde's throat. Immediately, blood gushed forth, and her screams turned into gurgling. Her warm blood splattered on the ground, and a man in a Michael Myers mask came up with a golden chalice that had a pentagram on it to collect the blood. Then the man in the skull mask took his knife and began to hack away at the blonde's body. The little kids held out their potato sacks, and the priest dropped pieces of her body into each of them. A bloody lock of hair went into the bag of a girl with a Princess Peach mask, a fingertip into the bag of a boy with the Optimus Prime mask. One girl with a bunny mask on cried with glee as an eyeball was tossed casually into her bag. I watched helpless as she was dolled out like some kind of sick treat to the children. I watched as they danced gleefully around the screaming cages of teenagers. The adults went to the great pile of wood and began to pour gasoline on it. One adult in an Iron Man mask lit the pile, and it burst into flames as a great bonfire. The light from the fire was intense, and the air shimmered with heat. My eyes began to well up with tears at the atrocity being committed in front of me. The adults started to drag their tied-up victims towards the fire. Then they lifted them up and tossed them alive onto the blazing pyre. I closed my eyes and covered my ears as they screamed in agony. I started to hear a chant being sung. I peeked up to watch from my window. The goblet of blood was being passed around to the people, who lifted their masks to reveal their lips and to take a sip of the freshly shed blood. The chanting got louder, with every person they threw into the flames. They repeated it over and over again. I can still remember the words. Obscura patris, excepta nostroque innocence sacrificio. Sanguis istai nobis det potestatem. Pater mendaci da nobis desideria cohordis nostris. Da nobis omnes gentes dominare. In tentationem potius induc nos. They chanted it over and over again. I wasn't sure how they were even able to chant loud enough to drown out the sounds of screaming people being burned alive. The children danced around the bonfire like demonic imps. I watched as an adult in a medieval plague mask began to look towards my house from far away. He walked away from the group towards my house. I watched as he got closer. 4 blocks away, 3 blocks away, 2 blocks away. Soon he was but 100 feet from my yard. I wanted to hide, I wanted to duck, but I frozen still in horror. Suddenly, someone's hand grabbed me from behind. I let out a scream that was quickly covered by a hand, which silenced me. I looked back. It was my mother. She ducked us both down beneath the window. She went up to my ear and whispered, "What on earth are you doing out of bed?" We both looked up as a shadowy figure got up to the window. The figure stood there, illuminated from behind by the yellow-orange of the town bonfire. We sat there frozen, not saying a word, until the figure slowly moved away from the window. We sat there a while longer, until we were sure he was gone. "My son," my mother whispered, "get to bed, and do not get out. Do not look out of the windows. Lay there until sunrise." I got up and did as I was told. I shut my door and got into bed. I tried to ignore the orange glow shining in from my window. I tried to ignore the chants. They had gotten louder. I tried to ignore it when I heard metal being dragged and teenagers screaming blood murder as they were tossed on the fire, trapped together in their metal cage. I tried not to listen as their flesh crackled and popped, and as their screams turned into whimpers. I tried to ignore the laughter of the children most of all. I listened as another person had their throats slit, as adults under masks sipped their blood like wine, like some kind of demented communion. I listened as women moaned and men slammed into them, like the applause of a concert. Their screams of pleasure echoed by the screams of agony. I listened as my mother stood outside my room, praying fervently. "The blood of Jesus cover us! The blood of Jesus cover us!" I listened as the chants outside turned into one repeated phrase, repeated over and over again. "Avai Satanas! Avai Satanas!" I could hear both the young and old chant it. It lasted all night, the same chant over and over again. More screams, more giggling, more sounds of bodies cut up and given to the children as treats. "Avai Satanas! Avai Satanas!" Somehow, at some point, I fell asleep. I awoke to my mother on my bed stroking my face. I asked her if what I saw last night is real. She said yes. Halloween is an evil holiday. I asked many questions. Why did she live here? Why didn't she call the cops? Why did this happen? My mom explained that the town was ran by a satanic cult. She couldn't be sure who was or wasn't a part of it. She had tried to call the cops one year, but without power, they couldn't be reached. And when she reported it to the local police, they had taken her report, but had done nothing about it. When she tried another department further away, they didn't believe her report. She had tried to get proof, but no one was willing to see it. They all just thought she was a crazy Christian lady. "Why didn't you warn the neighbors?" I asked, crying. "I did. They didn't believe me," she said, tears flowing from her own eyes. "I knew you'd never believe me either if I had told you. Besides, who wants to tell their child something so terrible?" I asked why she didn't keep me with my father every Halloween. She replied that she had to have me on weekends, per court order. That she had told my dad once, but he called her liar. He was too interested in having his own fun every few years, and he insisted I be with her, that she was making it all up. "No one thinks this stuff can happen," she said, "and no one believes people when they see it firsthand." I asked her why she had never moved far from the town to get away. "For one, I'm sure they'd stop me," she said. "And secondly, I cannot abandon the people of this town who don't know. I must warn them. I must do the work of the Lord." I then asked why they didn't come for us. "They would in a heartbeat. But they, for some reason, will only come for you if you invite them in, if you leave your doors and windows unlocked, if you talk to them, if they see you. I make it clear I'm not celebrating and that they can't come in, and I board the windows so they won't break in. They seem to hate anything to do with the cross, and they aren't too fond of salt." I went out that day after we had taken down the boards. I looked over at the town center. There was no evidence at all of the horrors of last night. They must have cleaned it all up somehow. I would have thought it all a bad nightmare if it wasn't for the distinct char on the asphalt, barely distinguishable unless you knew where to look, and the scraps of potato sack in the bushes around town. I'm 18 this year, a high school senior. This year Halloween falls on a Tuesday, so I'll be with my mom again. I told my dad I didn't want to go. I told him about what I had seen last year. He yelled at me and called me a liar. He doesn't believe me either. No one new to the town does. We managed to get a few more people to board up their places, but it's not enough to save them all. That's my story. I'm partially writing it to warn all of you reading. Halloween for most people is an innocent, fun, spooky holiday. For some, it's a pagan holiday used to celebrate the dead and to connect to the spirit realm. To a few, it's simply a harvest festival. For others, it's an evil holiday, and you never know who considers it so. You never know who underneath those innocent masks is in fact a ravenous wolf seeking to make you the next sacrifice to untold, incomprehensible, hellish evils. I've got to get going. I gotta help my mother pick up some new wooden boards at Home Depot. Halloween is coming in a week or two, and it's going to be here soon. One last thing before I go. I have a request to ask those of you who are reading. Pray for us. Pray that we will make it through another year of Halloween. I was working the closing shift at Footworks, the shoe store crammed into the far corner of the Chapel Hills Mall. Halloween was supposed to be a night of fun, but instead, I was stuck stocking sneakers for minimum wage. I only had a half hour left on my shift, and I could feel the seconds crawling by. The clock on my phone felt frozen at 7:30 p.m. I drummed my fingers on the counter, trying to stay awake. My manager, who was supposed to help close, had ducked out for an early smoke break and never came back. Most of the customers had already thinned out, but there were still a few stragglers wandering around the mall. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my friend Ben. Ben, yo, you coming tonight or what? I sighed. I'd been dodging the question all day. Ben's Halloween party was supposed to be the big event of the night. Half of the school was going, including all of my friends. But I hadn't planned on going. After my shift was over, all I really wanted to do was just crash in my bed. I started typing probably not when another text popped up. Ben, don't be lame, man. It's Halloween. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the keyboard. It had been a while since I'd done anything fun, and even though I didn't have a costume, I could probably grab something cheap from the Halloween store on the way. I wasn't exactly Mr. Social, but maybe it wouldn't hurt to get out of the house for once. Yo! A voice called from the store entrance, breaking my introspection. I looked up and saw Ben and Derek walking into the store like they owned the place. Ben flashed a grin, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Come on, bro. You're not getting out of this one. You're coming tonight, Ben said, leaning against the counter. Derek nodded, smirking. Yeah, man, you never come to anything. You didn't show up last year either. Look, I started. I'm just tired, and I don't even have a costume, and I don't even have time to... You've got time, Ben interrupted. The party doesn't start until 10. Grab something cheap and just show up. It's not like you have anything better to do. I sighed. They weren't wrong. As much as I wanted to protest, I started to give in to the pressure. Ben raised an eyebrow, a smirk growing on his face, anticipating my answer. Fine, I muttered. I'll come, but I probably won't stay long. Yes, there he is, Ben grinned, patting me on the shoulder. You're gonna have a good time, bud, trust me. Derek glanced at his watch. All right, well, we're heading out. See you there. I watched them leave, their laughter fading as they disappeared out of the mall. I wasn't sure I believed Ben about having a good time, but I was locked in now. I just had to make it through the last stretch of my shift, grab a costume, and then down a few drinks to make the night more tolerable. The mall was basically empty now. Most of the other stores were now closed, and the place began to get a little darker as more and more lights were turned off. I started mentally checking off the closing tasks, sweep the floor, cash out the register. Routine stuff. As I was counting the minutes to clock out, something caught my eye near the entrance. A person stood there, just outside the store, facing me. They were in a Halloween costume. A creepy red latex devil mask, which had a large pointy nose and a cartoonish wide smile which reached ear to ear. Small black horns protruded from the top of the mask. It looked pretty realistic, like one of those expensive movie-quality masks. Had it not been so startling, it would have actually been pretty impressive. The mask was paired with a mismatched black and red suit that looks like it was put together from pieces found at a thrift store. At first, I assumed it was just a last-minute shopper, or someone probably killing time before heading to a party. But they stood completely still, facing me, not moving, not browsing, not shopping, just standing there. I felt my chest tighten. There was no reason to be freaked out by some weirdo in a Halloween costume, but something about them made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The way they were just standing still, watching me, began to eat away at my nerves. I was about to tell him, "We're closed," when he turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked away. I just stared, frozen in place. His steps were slow, measured, almost robotic as he disappeared out of sight. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath the entire time. What the hell was that about, I thought. Just some creep messing around, probably. It was Halloween, after all. I shook it off, trying to refocus on closing the store and getting out of there. But every few seconds, I found myself glancing toward the entrance, half expecting to see that creepy guy in a devil mask there again, watching me. By the time I finally clocked out, I was beat, and my nerves were shot. I made my way out of the now empty mall toward my car, checking behind my shoulder every few seconds. I safely made it to my car, now fully convinced that the person, whoever it was simply messing around with me. I brushed off the feeling and headed to the Halloween store to pick up a costume for the party. The Halloween store was one of those pop-up stores that showed up every year, taking over abandoned sporting goods stores and the like. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, a chime ringing loudly in the nearly empty store. The place was a mess. Shelves were mostly empty now, and decorations were scattered all the floor, with a few straggling shoppers picking over the scraps. The sound of Halloween music played faintly through the speakers. I wandered aimlessly, searching for any scraps of a costume. The aisles were nearly bare, but I kept looking, feeling the pressure of time build. Suddenly, the music cut off, leaving the store in an uncomfortable silence. I knew I didn't have much time before they closed, so I hurried, eyes darting over the shelves. The door chimed again. Someone else had come in, but I didn't bother to look. I was too focused. At the end of one aisle, I found a small rack with cheap knockoff masks of famous movie killers. I grabbed a plastic Jason-style mask headed for the register, rushing to get out. As I turned the corner, my heart lurched. There he was, the man in the devil mask. He stood at the far end of the aisle, illuminated by the dim, flickering light. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me. My stomach twisted, and my throat went dry. No fucking way, I thought, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. He stood perfectly still, just staring. For a split second, I considered throwing the mask down and bolting. But something kept me rooted. Maybe it was disbelief, maybe shock. I told myself it was a coincidence, forcing my legs to carry me to the front. The cashier barely looked up from his phone as I approached, too busy scrolling through his phone. My skin crawled as I sensed the man in the devil mask moving closer, his eyes locked on me. I could feel it, the weight of his stare boring into me. "Just this," I muttered, tossing the cheap mask onto the counter. It felt so pointless, but at least I wouldn't show up to Ben's party without something. The cashier rang it up slowly, the beeps of the register cutting through the heavy silence. I kept my head down, resisting the urge to look back, but I knew he was still watching me. "That'll be $10.53, the cashier said, snapping his gum, finally glancing up at me. I handed him the crumpled bills, my hand shaking slightly as I grabbed the change and shoved the mask into a bag. Without another word, I made a quick escape toward the exit. The bell chimed again as I pushed through the door, and the cold night air hit me like a splash of water. I exhaled sharply, tension easing from my shoulders. Instinctively, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him, the man in the devil mask, standing at the entrance, following me still. But there was nothing, just the empty store and a couple of people loitering on the sidewalk. He was gone. Again. I shook my head and got in my car. I kept reminding myself, it's Halloween. Creepiness was just part of it. And besides, I had bigger things to worry about, like not making an idiot of myself at Ben's party. By the time I got to Ben's place, the party was already in full swing. Cars were parked up and down the block, and I could hear the bass from the music thumping before I even stepped out of my car. The house was decorated to the nines, fake cobwebs hanging from the trees, jack-o'-lanterns lining the walkway, and orange lights flickering in the windows. I could hear Rob Zombie's Dracula blasting from inside the house. I pulled the plastic hockey mask out of the bag and slipped it over my face. It wasn't much, but it would do. I didn't feel like going all out for this party anyway. I just wanted to blend in, have a few drinks, and hopefully avoid any awkward moments with people. The front door was wide open, and people were spilling out into the yard, already tipsy and laughing too loud. I stepped inside, and the smell of beer and sweat hitting me immediately. Ben's living room was packed, people in costumes, some elaborate, and some as half-assed as mine, dancing, drinking, and yelling over the blaring music. "Hey, you actually came!" Ben appeared out of nowhere, clapping me on the back hard enough to nearly knock me over. He was wearing a vampire costume, complete with fake blood dripping from his mouth. "Yeah, well, you didn't really give me a choice," I said jokingly, raising my voice to be heard over the music. "Here, grab a drink," Ben shouted, shoving a plastic cup of beer into my hand before I could protest. "We're playing beer pong in the kitchen, come on." I hesitated. Beer pong wasn't really my thing, but it was better than standing around awkwardly in the corner. "Sure, yeah, why not?" I followed him into the kitchen, where a crowd had gathered around a table lined with orange plastic cups. Someone had set up a fog machine, and the room was filled with swirling white mist, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. I took a swig of beer and tried to relax. It was just a party after all. We played several rounds. The beer had begun to do its job with loosening me up, and I was actually starting to have fun. For a moment, I even began to question myself on why I didn't come out more. But just as that thought occurred, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him again. The figure, that devil mask, that long pointy nose and wide smile. He was standing in the living room, just beyond the edge of the crowd, perfectly still like he had been at the store. He didn't move or try to talk to anyone. He just stood there, watching me. My throat went dry, and my stomach twisted into knots. What the hell was he doing here? How did he follow me here? I blinked, half expecting him to disappear, like a trick of the light. But when I looked again, he was still there. He raised his hand and gave me a slow, taunting wave and turned to leave. Maybe it was the drinks, or maybe it was the feeling of security from the crowd, but anger began to boil up inside me. I set my drink down and pushed through the crowd, trying to keep him in sight. I wanted to grab him and find out who he was and why the hell he was following me. But by the time I reached the living room, he was gone. Just like that. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. People were laughing, talking, and dancing like nothing was wrong. I thought about telling Ben, but what could I say? That some weirdo in a devil mask had been following me around all night. He'd just think I was being paranoid. I needed to calm down. I told myself it was just some guy playing a prank, maybe someone who had been at the mall earlier and recognized me. Or maybe it was someone I knew just messing with me. It was Halloween. People were supposed to be creepy. I grabbed another beer, took a long drink, and forced myself to relax. It was just in my head. It's nothing to worry about. I didn't stay at the party long after that. After a couple more beers and some awkward small talk, I made my excuses and slipped out. I just wasn't in the mood anymore. All I could think about was that guy. Every time I turned around, I expected to see him and his devil mask standing there, just watching. It was a relief to get back to my car and leave the noise and chaos behind. The streets were quiet as I drove home, the occasional group of teenagers in costumes still wandering the sidewalks. My parents' house was only a few blocks away, and when I pulled into the driveway, everything seemed peaceful. The porch light was on, and the pumpkins were lit on the front porch. I parked and walked up the front steps, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked the door. The quiet was almost comforting after the noise of the party. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. "Mom! Dad!" I called out, but there was no answer. They had probably gone to bed already. I flipped on the hallway light and headed for the stairs, planning to just crash in my room and forget about the whole night. But something stopped me. A sound, a drip, a slow, steady drip. Not the drip of a sink, a heavier, thicker drip. Slowly, I made my way toward the sound in the direction of the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes scanned around the house. As I got closer to the kitchen, the sound got louder, and there was something else, a smell, an odd smell, almost like copper, thick in the air. I rounded the corner into the kitchen when I saw the outline of something. Not something. Someone. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was my dad. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and so was my mom. Only something was wrong. They were sitting at the table, side by side, like they had been waiting for me. But there was something horribly wrong, so wrong that it took my brain a moment to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Their heads were gone. The jagged red stumps of their necks were all that remained, blood streaking down their clothes, pooling onto the floor. The table, once warm and familiar, was now soaked in it. My stomach lurched, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I stood frozen, in shock, every muscle locked in place, as my brain struggled to process the nightmare in front of me. At first, I wasn't able to comprehend if what I was seeing was real or some twisted hallucination. And then, I saw him. The man, the devil, was standing in the corner, almost blending into the shadows. He was big, much bigger up close, and his posture was unnervingly calm. In each hand he held a head, their heads by the hair, the thick strands twisted around his fingers. In his hands, I saw the source of the sound. Blood dripped from their severed heads, landing on the tile floor with a soft, rhythmic plip, plip, plip. The sound was horrible, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of the dripping and my own heartbeat. He didn't move, he didn't flinch. He just stood there, perfectly still. His arms were reached up toward me, holding my parents' heads proudly, like two trophies. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in fear. I slowly backed away, step by step, my eyes never leaving him. His head didn't turn, his body didn't shift. He just stared, with that pointy nose, that huge red smile, as if he were frozen in time. I kept moving backward, my chest tightening with every inch I gained. The last thing I saw before I turned and ran was the man still standing there in the corner, heads dangling from his hands, utterly motionless, his cold eyes boring into me. He never moved, and somehow that was worse. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. My fingers barely worked as I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I told the operator what had happened. When the police arrived, the house was empty. The man, the devil, was gone. They never found him. The police chalked it up to some kind of gruesome home invasion. But I knew the truth. He had been following me the whole night, maybe longer, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. He had wanted me to see, to know. He chose me for some reason. That was last Halloween, when my life was forever changed. I'm terrified he is going to come back for me this Halloween. I'm terrified that at any moment, I'm going to see that mask again.